the entire weekend over the internet. You just have to enter that code when you go and sign up. And it gives you this, this very reasonable discount to watch the weekend. And the weekend will be up for 6 months. We'll take it down in February of 2013 when we have our next weekend. So if you want to review some of the lectures, and I imagine there might be a person or two you want to share this with. It's not a lot. I mean, my goal is to spread as much information as possible. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, welcome back. Welcome back. We've had a great morning so far. Each of these presentations, these advanced study weekends, what I try and do is I try to put together new talks for you about things that I have learned recently. Like last night, I shared with you some of the things out of the newsletters, some of the new thoughts that I've had. And so I would like to share a few more things with you that are really important to me. I may have not expressed it enough this weekend, but if you follow me, you know how concerned I am about the future. You met my little grandson. He's been walking. Oh, there he is in the back of the room there. And that's Sam. That's my 4th grandson. Can you stand up, Patrick? My son, Patrick. And that's Sam. And I just want you to know that's why Mary and I do what we do now. Now, I'm of a retirement age. I easily could just quit and say, well, it's somebody else's turn to take over. Certainly, Mary and I have made enough money in life. That's not a drive for us. But the drive for us is to make a future for our grandchildren. We have 5 now. We have 4 grandsons. We have a granddaughter. And we'd like to make this place livable for them. And so that's my main goal, is to try and change the future. I want to change the world. Yeah, I really do. I want to change the world. And I want to do it for my grandkids and your grandkids. That's what I want to do. And part of this has to do with the diet wars. There are diet wars going on, and we need to be involved just like we were involved in a real battle. And the ultimate outcome of that battle could be life or death for all of us, planet. And so it's really important for me to define this war. This war has been going on for a long time. I remember when I first got started in this business, one of my heroes was Nathan Pritikin. As I mentioned to you last night, I had learned a lot of these things when I was a plantation doctor. I saw my plantation patients, my first generation who lived on rice and vegetables, not sick, working into their 80s and 90s, living on rice and vegetables, a little meat, no dairy. And I watched their kids transition to the Western diet and get fatter and sicker. And that was my first clue that diet was important and it could be a game changer in terms of preventing disease. It took me a while to figure out that you could also stop the things that make you sick and you get well. And part of that transition to that understanding was a man named Nathan Pritikin, who was one of the most powerful advocates of eating a high carbohydrate, plant food based, low fat, low animal food diet. I mean, let's make this clear. Saturated fat and cholesterol, that's animal foods. That's meat and poultry and dairy and cheese and so on. That's what they're saying when they're saying saturated fat and cholesterol. Right, industry doesn't want you to name the actual foods. They would rather have you call it saturated fat and cholesterol so you get confused. And when you say carbohydrate, what you're saying are plant foods. Well, Nathan Pritikin was a very strong advocate of the kind of diet that I believe in, and I've learned much from him, and I owe a lot of credit to this man. And I remember the days when he used to be in a constant battle with the antithesis of the truth, and that's Robert Atkins. He is what I would consider, his ideas are what I would consider evil. And Nathan Pritikin, to define it any other way, I would consider his points of view as good. And that's where the battle lines were drawn many years ago. It was in the 70s and 80s. Nathan Pritikin and Robert Atkins spent hours debating on national television shows, and it got to the point where Nathan Pritikin clearly said, Robert Atkins, your diet is killing people. It's clogging their arteries and killing people. And Robert Atkins says, no, eating meat and butter and lard, I mean, that's good for your arteries. And you know what? He sued Nathan Pritikin. And Nathan Pritikin would have gone to the mat for him for that fight. For us, he'd have gone to the mat with that lawsuit. But unfortunately, he died at age 70. And the way it was ultimately resolved is the Pritikin Foundation paid Robert Atkins off. And that made me mad. It makes me mad to this date, but that's the way it turned out. Traditional low-carb diets, these high-protein, high-fat diets that go under many names like Scarsdale and Stillman and Atkins and Zone and South Beach and Ducan. And then we have promoters, very strong promoters. Any of you on the internet, you hear of the Weston Price Foundation headed by Mary Enig and Sally Fallon. And then we have Gary Taubes out there writing articles in the New York Times about how good Atkins is and how bad it is to eat carbs. So they have their army. And they're traditional. They've been going on for years. Actually, more than what I just listed. This high-protein, high-fat, low-carb philosophy has been going on that I know of for more than 100 years. But we have a new low-carb movement. And they disguise themselves as being healthy. And what they do is they are really apologists for the traditional Atkins diet of butter and brie. They are apologists in the sense that they add lots of what we call non-starchy green and yellow and orange vegetables. And somehow that's supposed to compensate for all the animal foods, all the meat and the dairy that is added by adding these extra non-starchy. In other words, no bread, no rice, no corn, no potatoes. To compensate for that, the idea of eating all the meat you want, or pretty much all the meat that you want, is to add these green and yellow vegetables. And these diets come under the name of paleo, Paleolithic diets, paleo diet, caveman diet, Stone Age diet, hunter-gatherer diet. That brings up a lot of thoughts for you, doesn't it? The traditional diet of people. In fact, the theory is this, is that our ancestors ate a diet primarily of meat. They were hunter-gatherers with the emphasis on hunter, and as a result of 2 million plus years of evolution, we evolved to be hunter-gatherers with the emphasis on hunter. We evolved to eat lots and lots of meat. So they tell us, meat, that's good. You can eat fish and chicken and beef and pork, any kind of animal food. Seafood is great. Oh yes, you can have these non-starchy green and yellow vegetables. Fruits, they're okay too. But don't you dare eat bread or potatoes or rice, because these are evil. These are the foods that contain lots of carbohydrate. These are what I call starches. Those are forbidden. And to their credit, they do forbid some things that I think are not good for you, as well as you can easily recognize as not being good for you. They forbid dairy. They forbid sugar. They forbid oils, except for maybe olive oil. The Bible of Paleo Diet was written by a man named Loren Cordain. He's a PhD. He works for Colorado State University. Anybody who's involved in this paleo idea, these paleo nutritions, it also goes under primal nutrition or primal diets. Anybody that's involved in these types of programs, they look up to Loren Cordain as their hero. He wrote the Bible, the Paleo Diet, and I've read this book. As a matter of fact, in the slides that follow, you'll see parentheses, which represent page numbers from this particular book, if you want to go back and see the actual quotes that were made for this book. Cordain says that the paleo diet is the one and only diet that ideally fits our genetic makeup. He claims that every human being on Earth ate this way for the past 2.5 million years. Everyone. In fact, he says there wasn't a single person who did not follow the paleo diet. Now that brings up a little suspicion, doesn't it? Well, it should bring up a lot of suspicion. Where he comes to this understanding is where a lot of people, poorly educated people who are not up with the scientific literature, people of old, 40, 50, 100 years ago, who used to do archaeologic diggings, what they did is that they dug around a village, the campfire site and so on, and they looked for remnants of people who lived 100, 200, a million years ago. What they found is they found bones. They found tools, stone tools, for example. They found cuts on the bones. They didn't find any pea pods, no orange peels, no corn husks after 50,000 years. So their conclusion was that these people obviously were primarily hunters, because all we could see is evidence of animal eating by that crude kind of archaeology. And by the way, all archaeologists the majority of the archaeology community, if not all of them, recognize that this was the problem for coming up with incorrect theories. And so when doctors started looking around for other remnants of what people eat, they found some clues that we really weren't that big of meat eaters. I believe, by the way, that there were probably no societies in the past, or large societies today even, that lived on a pure vegan diet. Let's face it, people ate some animal foods throughout most of human history, but the idea that they ate a lot of plant foods in their diet had to come from some more careful archaeology. What they had to do is look for different evidence of plant eating, like these right here. These are called starch granules or amyloplasts. They're parts of a cell. Inside of a plant cell is stored starch. Starch is long chains of sugar, either straight chains or branching chains, called amylose and amylopectin. And these chains, which are made as a consequence of photosynthesis by plants, plants make these sugars, glucose, and turn them into chains for their own use. They store this sugar for their own needs, like to make it through the winter. Or when spring comes, you need energy to sprout anew, to become a new plant. And so the plant stores its energy inside its cells or cytoplasm in the form of these vacuoles called amyloplasts, starch grains or starch granules. Investigators have looked into archaeologic findings and found evidence of these starch granules and other plant parts that have lasted eons. For example, 2 million years. Recent archaeologic findings that date back 2 million years when they looked at the dentition, the teeth of the remains of people that lived 2 million years ago, they found parts of fruits, parts of wood bark, parts of grass, parts of sledge. In other words, evidence as far as 2 million years ago that people ate like chimpanzees and other lesser primates do today. From 105,000 years ago in East Africa, Mozambique, when they dug around the village site, what they found is they found these starch granules, these cubicle-type starch granules. They're from grains. The ones that are more round are from underground storage organs like potatoes and various other tubers and roots. So you see, they found these particular parts of plants preserved for 100,000 years. They found them on the tools, and their conclusion is that people were consuming grains and other plant parts for 105,000 years or more. The Neanderthal is the ultimate in the meat eater in people's minds. When they think about primates that are very close to the current human, people think about the Neanderthal, and the immediate thought is this is the ultimate hunter, gatherer. But evidence is that's not the case. They looked at skeletons of Neanderthals all the way from the cold north of Europe down to the sunny Mediterranean, and they found in these skeletons, they found evidence of starch eating when they looked between the teeth of these various skeletons. Dating back 44,000 years, they found these starch granules. And these starch granules match starch granules that we can make today just by cooking various starches like potatoes. The bottom row shows pictures of starch granules from current foods that were cooked in laboratories and photographed. The one at the top represents starch grains, starch granules, amyloplasts from 44,000 years ago from Neanderthals. So we have clear evidence that the Neanderthals ate cooked starch. When this article came out, which is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the headlines in the internet were the end of the Paleolithic diets, because what these findings were of 3 separate populations in Europe. They looked at the grinding tools, and what they found from these 3 separate populations in Europe dating back 30,000 years ago. Remember, according to the Paleolithic theory, according to the Paleo Diet Bible, before 10,000 years ago, nobody ate these foods. And yet they found evidence of abundant use of various starches in 3 separate populations in Western Europe. 14,000 years ago, that's before 10,000 years ago, we have evidence of organic material being consumed by people. To find that evidence, you had to look in a special situation. This was 150 miles south of Santiago, Chile. This is an excavation site that was covered up eons ago by peat bog. And so the peat preserved the organic material. One of the few cases where we can actually find evidence dating back 14,000 years of actual organic material that were used by people. This is the first evidence of potato eating. 44 different edible kinds of plants were found in this excavation. 22 different kinds of medicinal plants were found in this excavation. Clear evidence that people were plant eaters. Now you date more recent findings, 8,000 years ago in western Peru. What they found were 7 skeletons. They looked between the teeth of the skeleton. You can see the teeth in this particular photograph. They looked in the teeth of the skeletons, and when they looked between the teeth, what did they find? They found these. These are starch granules. Again, clear evidence that people were starch eaters. Wherever you look in the world where we have clear historical evidence, we have documentation, written documentation, not just fragments of people's civilization, but written documentation of what people have eaten. What we find is that all large successful populations of people throughout all of verifiable recordable history have consumed the bulk of their calories in starch. These are examples that you knew about long before you met me. You knew that the Aztecs and the Mayans were the people of the corn. They lived on corn. And a little further south, you have the Incas, who lived on potatoes. If you've been to Peru, you still know that's their culture today. And the Peruvians, the Incas, they lived on potatoes primarily until they went to battle, and then they switched to quinoa because they thought that offered more strength. You look to the Middle East, that used to be the breadbasket of the world. That's where people lived on bread made from barley and wheat. It powered civilizations for tens of thousands of years. And then you look to the Far East, and what do you see? Even today, people from Thailand and Cambodia and China and Japan, they're rice eaters. In fact, the good morning greeting in China, instead of saying, "How are you?" it's, "Have you had your rice today?" That's how important rice is in those particular cultures. There are 1.73 billion Asians who live on rice-based diets. And people tell you rice makes you fat. Well, where are those fat Asians? In the United States, right? They gave up their rice. All right, getting back to the philosophy of the paleo diets. In the paleo diet, you're encouraged. In fact, the basis of this diet is meat. 55% of your food should come from animal sources. That's beef, poultry, fish, eggs. 55% of your diet can come from these particular foods. The typical fare are things that you're familiar with, like beef and veal and pork and chicken, but they also tell you it is good. And you certainly aren't discouraged, if not encouraged, to eat some animals that you don't typically think of as food, like alligators and snakes and deers and bears and so on. Nothing's off the menu. You can basically eat anything that ever walked, crawled, or swam on this kind of diet. And they actually offer mail-order suppliers for these wild animals in this book. Yeah. They even tell you that the old people, the Paleolithic people from 2.5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, that's the Paleolithic period, that they lived on, as part of their diet, bone marrow and brains. I think that's a bit repulsive, don't you? But we're supposed to eat like our ancestors do. We're supposed to eat brains and bone marrow of animals, and if we're really supposed to eat like our ancestors do, don't forget one delicacy, which was adolescents and children. Yeah, it's called nutritional cannibalism. That means eating fellow human beings for nutrition and enjoyment. And you see evidence that was found almost 1 million years ago of people who were butchered with slices across their bones that were put there by stone tools of the people of that time. Yeah, so I guess if you're going to be a true paleo follower, you really must eat like your ancestors. Well, these diets are a nutritional nightmare. There have been many articles published about the hazards of these low-carb, high-protein, high-fat diets, all the way from Atkins to paleo. And the British Medical Journal just came out a few months ago and published the results of these low-carb, high-protein diets in a large analysis. And they said that these increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly in women. The conclusions are clear from scientific research and the summaries that have been provided that these diets are dangerous. Whenever anybody comes out with these kinds of broad statements that are heard worldwide, folks in the Atkins Nutraceuticals, their Atkins Foundation, they respond back by threatening lawsuits. Yeah, well, you know, they did that with Nathan Pritikin 30 years ago. They'll try it again today. But I think the public is so well aware, the scientific community is so solid, the evidence is so unrefutable that these foods are dangerous, no matter how hard and how often they tell you otherwise. These foods are a health hazard. But I guess if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes true. And they do that. They have a large megaphone to talk to people about something that often they like to hear. People love to hear good news about their bad habits. Tell me it's good to eat pork chops. You know, well, people often fall into that because of their own personal habits. However, if you look at the evidence, the clear scientific evidence, the experiments done in laboratories, and also the population experiments, what you find is that people thrive on diets low in meat, low in dairy, and high in starches. Like, for example, there are the blue zones, which were published in National Geographic the first time. And this is a study of the various populations of people who are most long-lived in the world. And what these populations, be they from Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Greece, or the Seventh-day Adventists right here in California, what they all have in common is they're near vegetarian. They eat starch-based diets. Now, what better evidence that you could have than just looking at people who currently are alive and well and thriving and longest lived? What kind of diets do they eat? Well, they don't eat low-carb diets. They eat high-carb diets, starch-based diets with fruits and vegetables, and minimal amounts of animal food intake. And that is an absolutely consistent finding. And then we also have major studies that have been done over the last 50 years, and research that has impressed the world, like, for example, Walter Kempner at Duke University. In 1939, he started the rice diet at Duke University. It was the most financially successful thing about Duke University for 4 decades, the rice diet in Durham, North Carolina. Walter Kempner is probably my most important medical hero. He fed people who were sick with severe heart disease, diabetes, arthritis. He fed them a diet of white rice, because that was most available and most acceptable. I know, terrible white rice, but that's what you got. You got white rice. And you got some fruits. And you got a little sugar to make up for the calories. And he took people with failing kidneys, with hearts so big that if you took a chest x-ray, that's all you saw in the chest x-ray was heart. He took people with abnormal EKG findings, people who were dying, and they switched them off their typical American diet to the rice diet of rice and fruits and sugar, and maybe a little later on, if you got healthy, you got some vegetables, and then a little bit of meat, maybe later on. And he cured people with terrible illnesses, you know, long before I was born. And then you have Nathan Pritikin doing the same thing and publishing the results in our scientific journals. And as I talked to you about last night, Dr. Roy Swank, who worked as the head of neurology for 25 years at Oregon Health and Science University, he used a diet very low in saturated fat. And you know what saturated fat means? That means meat and dairy. And he essentially cured people with multiple sclerosis. So the major scientific treatments based upon diets are based upon high-carb, low-meat diets, not otherwise. These kinds of diets, let's just say it were true, and that people should be eating a paleo diet. In fact, I've often thought if I ever get a chance to be on a television program with one of the folks who recommend these low-carb, high-protein, high-fat, paleo-type, Atkins-type diets, and they started battling with me about the research. And you can look at lots of research, you can interpret it in various ways, and you know, people can be very selective and cherry pick what they want to talk about. And I could just see the audience out there getting all confused. Well, you got your studies that say that eating a high-carb diet cures diabetes, but Atkins has his study that says that eating a low-carb diet will cure diabetes. Yeah, because it makes them so sick they lose weight and then their diabetes goes away. That's why that works. But I may not have a chance to say that. So you get through all this argument, all this confusion, all this battling going on, and then what I plan on saying is, yeah, but even if you were right, what are the environmental and planetary and future consequences if we adopted that kind of diet? What would be the consequences? It would be an ecological disaster. We're heading for the brink of destruction of the planet Earth and its inhabitants right now. It would rapidly hurry up that destruction if that occurred. Right now, there are organizations like World Watch Institute that estimate more than 51% of the greenhouse gases are a direct consequence of producing animal foods for people. A more conservative estimate comes from the World Health Organization, their publication in November of 2006 called Livestock's Long Shadow. They estimated that 18% of the greenhouse gases are from livestock production, as opposed to 13 to 14% that you heard last night is due to all transportation. It would be a disaster for planet Earth if people adopted this kind of eating widespread. And they are. I mean, more and more they are. You hear a lot more about paleo eating and Atkins eating than you do hear about high-carb eating. I don't know, maybe that's not true. Vegetarian is becoming pretty darn popular, isn't it, with Bill Clinton and Michelle Pfeiffer and other celebrities standing up. I mean, people who are beautiful people who are getting healthier and handsomer as the days go on because they've made this simple change. I don't know, maybe we're winning. I hope so. Another report has to do with our water supply. It takes, and this impressed me, 4,000 to 18,000 gallons of water to produce one juicy hamburger. Yeah. At the end of his book, Dr. Cordain, and by the way, this is the picture on the left-hand side that he uses on his current book. I don't know where the heck this came from. I guess high school graduation. But that's his current picture he uses on his book. This happens, the one on the other side of the frame is the result of 20 years of eating the paleo diet. At the end of the book, in the additions he puts in his new revision of the paleo diet, he says, without them, starches like wheat, corn, and potatoes, the world could probably support 1/10 or less of the present population. You know, we have an overpopulation problem. Nobody questions it. There are solutions out there for handling the overpopulation, such as what China did, which is 1 child per family. There are other solutions out there that are even less popular, like a viral epidemic, or maybe some type of catastrophic war to reduce the population. But let's just say that's not an option on the table to reduce the population. At current population, according to Cordain, we could support 1/10 of the people. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to pick 10 of your friends or family members out and choose which 9 will die so that people can eat the paleo diet. Because Cordain says you cannot support the current population without starches. So 9 or 10 of your friends and family members are out of here. They must go if we're going to do something as uncivilized as eating the paleo diet, which is destroying animals and the planet, and would have to, based on Cordain's calculations, would have to take and eliminate 90% of the population on planet Earth. The next question you come to when you talk about hunter-gatherers is, what is it about hunter-gatherers that makes them healthy? Is it because of what they ate? You know, it might not be. It might be because they exercised a lot. Maybe that's why. Some of your friends will say that. You know, those people in Japan, the reason that they're so thin and healthy looking, it's not because of the rice, it's because they exercise so much. Well, you know, people in these less developed countries like China, well, China, that's not less developed anymore, is it? But in parts of the world that have been traditionally less developed, yeah, some people work harder. They're out in the farm, in the fields, and they're plowing the fields by hand, and they're harvesting the crops and so on. But there are a lot of people in these societies who don't do that. They're school teachers and bankers and ministers and writers and public speakers, and they don't exercise. But they're all trim, aren't they? Anyway, looking back at the paleo issue, scientists looked at traditional hunter-gatherers. In this case, they looked at the Hadza tribes, and these are people who are in north-central Tanzania. And they studied these populations of people, and they carefully looked at their energy expenditures. And what they found is these traditional hunter-gatherers, which are trim, healthy, hardy people without heart disease, people who don't have the traditional types of diets that we have, They eat healthier diets, of course, less refined food, and not so many animal products either. They do some hunting, yeah. The men go out and they try and catch an animal here or there or get a little bit of honey. But most of the food supply is obtained by the less important people, the grandparents, the women, the children, even in those societies. Well, when they measure their energy expenditures of the traditional hunter-gatherer populations, they don't expend any more energy than people living in Western societies. It's not exercise. It's the food. Not to tell you exercise isn't of value, but that's a scapegoat. You've got to fix the food. In February of 2010, we had a special guest here. That was Dr. Nathaniel Dominy. Did anybody come to hear that presentation? Yeah, I worked for 4 years to get Dr. Dominy to come to this advanced study weekend right here in the room. And Dr. Dominy gave a presentation. It was actually in February of 2011, wasn't it? Sure. February 2011. Dr. Dominy gave a presentation about his work on diet and evolution. That's what he specializes at Dartmouth College. And he told you about the historical data. He told you about the genetics of human beings that make us starch eaters. And he gave a presentation that those of you who heard it will never forget.
And so what do we tell our friends and relatives who tell us that we're primarily meat eaters because we're hunter-gatherers? With an emphasis on hunter because that's, the man thing to do, and gathering's the woman thing to do.
That's a myth. Hunters and gatherers, the majority of their calories come from plant foods.
So
that's a myth. Hunters and gatherers, the majority of all the calories that any hunting and gathering population gets comes from its plant foods. So that's what's most reliable. Meat is just too unpredictable. You can't rely on it.
So as a summary statement, as an expert anthropologist, you've spent your whole life studying the human diet and its relationship to teeth and bones and chemicals and genes and so on. Your conclusion is the human being is a
starchivore.
Could I use that in my new book?
Okay, sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Anyway, the truth is clear in the anthropological community. The scientists know better. As a matter of fact, when I wrote the article on the paleo diet in the June 2012 newsletter, I sent it to many of the famous anthropologists around the country, and the responses I got back were all positive. They thanked me for doing the summary I did, and the title of the article is "The Paleo Diet is Uncivilized, Unhealthy, and Untrue." That's what I wrote. And the anthropologic community, by and large, agrees with that. All right, so these are the boundaries that I see and have defined as where the diet wars exist. It's between good and evil. I don't know any other way to say it. It's between good and evil. Good, you know what side I believe that is. It's the people who recommend plant foods that are healthy for people, healthy for the planet, and of course, healthy for the animals. And then there's the evil side that destroys people's lives. It destroys the beautiful animals on this planet, and it's destroying planet Earth itself. Those are the battle lines. But unfortunately, those people are on my side of the battle line. They got their own battles going. And that's very disturbing to me because I can't see how we're going to accomplish what needs to be accomplished unless we all get together, unless the troops all join and become unified and speak out against evil. That's what I feel. There are many types of plant-based diets that are discussed, and those who author those particular kind of diets, sometimes they get very personal about this, and they want credit, and they want people to believe that it was their origination, this kind of diet. It all came spontaneously to them. They were just standing there one day, and the Lord put the idea in their head. Let me talk to you about some of these diets that are really the same. They're all on our side, but they're different, and the differences are what people are focusing on. It's time to stop that. Like Dr. Neil Bernard, who's been a guest here, he recommends a diet based on starches, vegetables, and fruits, but he is, of course, very strong into animal rights. And anything animal is verboten. You cannot eat it. That's one of the primary rules of the diet. Of course, he does also recommend a healthy diet. And then we have the Daniel diet, which is actually a diet that is current. That's based upon Daniel's teachings in the Bible. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But the Daniel diet basically teaches the kind of diet that we all teach. And this is a China study with T. Colin Campbell. T. Colin Campbell recommends a diet of starches, vegetables, and fruit, and 10% or less of the food comes from animals. And then we have the CHIP program, which changes its name all the time. It's now being called the Complete Health Improvement Program by Hans Deal. He's been a guest here also. So Dr. Campbell, Dr. Bernard, Dr. Deal have been guests here to speak to you. The CHIP program is based on the Seventh-day Adventist religion. At least their association is very close to them. Based is not the correct word, but they are associated with the Seventh-day Adventist religion as far as its teachings in part and also its foundings. Starches, vegetables, and fruits. Vegetarian diet. And then we have Dr. Esselstyn, who's also been a guest here. Dr. Esselstyn teaches a starch-based diet with fruits and vegetables, but he forbids, in most cases, not all cases, particularly with heart disease, he says, no nuts, seeds, and avocados. That's the extra special difference for the Esselstyn diet. No nuts, seeds, and avocados. And then we have the Engine 2 diet, which is his son, who's also been a guest here. And what he teaches is starches, vegetables, and fruits. And then we have Dr. Furman, who was a guest here at the last Advanced Study Weekend. And I brought Dr. Furman here specifically so that we could meet minds and we could join together to move these diet wars along and identify and stand up against the proper enemy and stop the fighting between us. And some of you were at this meeting. We had a debate and everything right here. And my conclusion was is that Dr. Furman and I agree on an awful lot of things. And our differences are insignificant in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. I want to tell you, in last month's newsletter, August 2012, I wrote about the diet wars. And I expressed my opinions about them. And I also included there some statements that appear on my discussion board. And the statements come from Dr. T. Colin Campbell, Dr. Joel Furman, and Dr. Esselstyn. They all published on my discussion board. I'll leave it to you to read those discussions. But the disagreements are serious. And the reason I published those particular discussions from these three and very important men is because I wanted things settled. I want to get on with what's important. I wanted to air the dirty laundry, so to speak, so that we can all get it settled and we can continue to win the battle against the true enemy, which are those people who recommend low-carb, high-meat diets. Atkins, Paleo, Zone, Dukan, etc. And I think I accomplished that. We'll see. Right now there's a lot of angry people out there, but that's just too bad because I have a different goal in mind. And then we have the Hallelujah Diet, which is a Christian-based program which consists 85% of raw, uncooked, and 15% of cooked plant foods. Another vegan diet. They've done a lot of good. The Kepler diet I just talked about. There's the macrobiotic diet, which goes back to the 1600s. The 1600s they've been teaching macrobiotics, which is grains and vegetables and very little meat, maybe a little fish. Yep. And then there's, of course, what I believe, which is a starch-based diet with fruits and vegetables. As you heard me discuss, any animal food you eat at most should be things like a little turkey for Thanksgiving, maybe an egg for Easter. That's the way I look at it. I know, you've been having Easter every morning, right? And, you know, Thanksgiving and Christmas, they happen every day, and every night after dinner you've had a birthday party. Well, it's time to stop all those holidays every day, is what I believe. And the other thing that I do to distinguish a little bit, where I put the emphasis, and it's not for pride, it's for you. In fact, I call the book The Starch Solution for you. Well, people say that's a suicide title. If you call the book The Starch Solution, everybody's going to discount it, throw it out. They're not going to look at it because everyone knows that starch is bad for you. Starch is something you use to stiffen shirts. Starch is white glop. It's white bread and cookie dough. And starches make people fat. You know, like the 1.73 billion Asians who live on rice who are all obese. Yeah, right. Okay, so that's the McDougall interpretation. There's the natural hygiene interpretation, which goes back to the mid-1800s, with Herbert Shelton, he tells you that you should eat a plant food-based diet, maybe a little fasting, maybe a little raw food, a little food combining. They've got their own particular variations, which are, as I'm trying to make the point, unimportant. Ornish diet, you heard from Dean Ornish last night. Pam Popper has been a guest here. In fact, I'll be in Columbus, Ohio in November talking to Pam Popper's group. Starch-based diet, fruits and vegetables, and Nathan Pritikin, one of my most important heroes. Nathan Pritikin teaches the diet. In fact, the Pritikin program still is around. It's been modified from what Nathan Pritikin originally taught. So make sure you know that when you see the current Pritikin diet and the current Pritikin philosophy. It's not what Nathan Pritikin used to teach. It's been liberalized a bit, but they still have the emphasis. They're still on our team. They're still part of the good guys. And that's the Pritikin diet. And then there are a couple of modern variations, socially acceptable diets, such as the DASH diet, which is the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. Received a lot of publicity. That's a starch-based diet with fruits and vegetables and a little low-fat dairy. And then they have a new dietary program that's out from the National Institutes of Health, the National Education Program. The National Institutes of Health, National Education, Cholesterol Education Program has put out a diet, which is, again, it's in the same direction. Plant foods, avoid saturated fats, which are animal fats. So we have all these various diets. And everybody's declaring originality and turf. They invented this. Their diet is best. And we have all these fights going on over a lousy nut. We're fighting about a nut. And who suffers from those disagreements? The public is confused, and I get emails all the time. Why can't you diet doctors agree? And I used to think what they said is, why can't you agree? Like, you people are just stupid. Instead, what they're saying is, look, we want to get on with our lives. If the truth is out there, why don't you guys get together, and gals? Why don't you get together and tell the truth so we can get our health back together and save our families? That's what they're asking, and that's what I'm asking, is why can't we get together? I would suggest we just go back to the original, or at least it's certainly one of the earliest recommendations of the treatment that I use, and that's in the first chapter of Daniel of the Bible, 2,600 years ago. Daniel says to the gatekeeper, he says, please test our servants who are living in the king's castle, eating the king's food. You test them. We want you to give them pulses and water, which are vegetables and water. Give those to our men, and 10 days later, evaluate what you see. And what they found is 10 days later, those who switched to the Daniel diet of vegetables and water were much healthier than those men who continued to consume the royal food 2,600 years ago. Oh, by the way, we were on a 10-day program here. All right, so, we've got a future that is just downright scary. You can't be alive and awake today and not realize there are some serious things going on in terms of our climate. We just went through, in fact, we're still in the midst of a drought that devastated the middle section of the United States. Somewhere around 60-80% of the crops have been destroyed by drought, by inclement weather, by climate change. And we know where that comes from. There are doubters, but there are no educated doubters these days about climate change. We know that the human being is contributing greatly to climate change, and that gives us the potential to change things. But how do we change things? How do we make that? You can't change the fact. You can't change the weather. Isn't that what they say? You can't change the weather. So we're going to have to live with the world that we have. There's actually an article that came out last week that said that by 2050, the bulk of the population of the world will be vegetarian. Not by choice. You folks are getting way ahead of the parade. Not by choice, they're going to be vegetarian. There are changes coming, so what can we do? I believe that we can direct those changes and make them less painful and maybe get some positive outcomes. And to direct those changes for the future, we should look to the past and see what people did during other difficult times. Look to the past. Like, for example, and what I want to talk to you about right now is an experience that occurred during World War I, between 1914 and 1918 in Western Europe. During World War I in Western Europe, Britain set up a naval blockade in the North Sea to starve the Germans. And they were successful. 400,000 Germans suffered from malnutrition or starved to death during that period of time, in 1914 to 1918. But there was a man, Hinhede, Dr. Mikkel Hinhede from Denmark, who was a nutritionist. He was a medical doctor. He'd been doing studies. He actually had a position as in the Laboratory of Nutritional Research in Copenhagen. He was the advisor to the Danish government during World War I. And he'd been doing experiments on nutrition as a medical doctor, as a nutritionist, on human beings. And he would take people, like for example, he took a guy named Matson, and he fed him for a year and a half potatoes and water and a little margarine, a little extra fat. That's all the man got. And after a year and a half, he was in tremendous health. He did the same thing with barley and a little bit of margarine. You see, you needed the extra fat. Margarine is, basically just pure oil. No protein, no vitamins, no minerals unless you add them. They just added it for the extra calories is why they added the oil or the margarine. And he, back in the 1800s, was taking care of people by feeding them diets of just potatoes or just barley and a little bit of margarine. Barley and potato thing, that lasted for about 6 months. Really, you need to add a little vitamin A and vitamin C in the form of a fruit or a vegetable to maintain a grain or a legume-based diet. But you can do it on just potatoes and water. Sweet potatoes and water, you can live successfully. It has all the vitamins and minerals, et cetera, you need except for B12, which is a whole other just topic. And he'd shown that. In fact, in his experiments and in his discussions with the government in Denmark, they didn't even consider protein as an issue because they knew back then, 100 years ago, intelligent people, well-educated people knew that this wasn't even a factor because you could not design a diet that was too low in protein, and they knew that. The minimum protein requirement was so small, it wasn't even a factor in designing their diets. All right, so here we have a situation. World War I, we've got the Germans starving to death. 400,000 of them died during that 4-year period of time, or suffered malnutrition or died during that period of time. And one of the reasons that they suffered so much is they continued to use as a model of proper nutrition for the German population, they used the model of the typical Western diet. They refused to change the composition of the foods. Even though there were fewer of them, they kept insisting the population eats meat for their protein. Well, Mikkel Hinhede, medical doctor, nutritionist, he went to the Danish government, a very important position there, and he said, look, we can do this a better way without people suffering and dying. What we need to do is we need to stop feeding the barley and the wheat and the soybeans to the cows and the pigs. Dairy production went down by 1/3. Only the farmers had pigs. The people in the rest of the country did not have any pork during that time. Beef was unknown, except they were extremely rich during that period of time. They even stopped making as many alcoholic beverages to save on grains. And what they did instead is they fed the population in Denmark a diet of wheat and barley and potatoes. And what happened is the people in Denmark thrived. They did not suffer hunger. Not only did they thrive in terms of not suffering hunger and malnutrition, they thrived in terms of disease. These people were studied and their results were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The results of the people, they looked at the mortality rate. Remember I talked to you last night? Mortality rate is really the only thing that counts, is how frequently people died. And they looked at the mortality rate in Denmark during this period of time in 1914 and 1918, and during the most severe deprivation, so to speak, or the time that required most shift to a starch-based diet and away from animal foods, between 1916 and 1918, the risk of dying dropped dramatically, about 34%. That means from heart disease and all other kinds of conditions. The people in Denmark during World War I became healthier. Well, the other people who didn't make these sensible changes to getting calories from starch instead of animals, they suffered malnutrition and died. We can learn from that experience. Yes, we can, and that same kind of observation was made throughout all of Western Europe during both world wars. For example, the death rate from diabetes in England, you notice that the death rate from diabetes was increasing prior to 1914. And then World War I came along, food became less available, rich foods became scarce, People had to eat starches, vegetables, and fruits, and the death rate from diabetes and heart disease and multiple sclerosis and various other diseases plummeted drastically. And then good times returned after World War I. The good food returned. People got sick. They had more heart disease, more multiple sclerosis, more diabetes, more complications from these diseases. And then World War II set in, and in Western Europe, by the way, a time of tremendous stress. You have Nazi Germany occupying the country, killing people, gas chambers. What more stress could there be? And yet people got healthier during these times. This is my final statement on low-carb, high-carb people. I don't know how much more clear I can make it. I know some of this is offensive to some of you. There's so much at stake here. I'm willing to say it like it is. People who recommend these low-carb diets, they themselves are fat and sick. When somebody's telling you how good the Atkins diet is or the paleo diet, say, wait a minute, let's look at the founders, let's look at the promoters, let's look at people who are telling you these are good for you and see what they look like and see how they've fared on their own programs. You know, these are undeniable facts. These diets make you sick, they make the planet sick. It's time to align ourselves. The people who believe, as I do, in a healthy plant-based diet, we have to stop fighting among ourselves. Instead, we need to fight those who are destroying the planet for us and making people sick. That's the diet wars. They're ongoing. The battle lines are drawn, and we're going to win because we got it right. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, we got great lunch for you. This